So imagine you're 62 years old with $2.1 million in retirement savings. You're probably asking yourself, do I have enough money to retire yet? In this video, we're going to walk through this exact situation, uncovering all the important aspects that determine if you are retirement ready. I'm a certified financial planner and owner of a fee-only financial planning firm, and we help guide individuals and couples through the confusing world of retirement planning. And see, understanding your path to retirement does not have to be complicated. Unfortunately, one of the biggest mistakes retirees make is following generalized advice that is not tailored to their unique financial or living situation. Through my hundreds of consultations, I have seen numerous retirees following advice that lead them into retirement underprepared to handle the risks that come along with making the jump. Fortunately, in this video, we'll not only be breaking down whether a couple age 62 with $2.1 million saved can retire, but we'll also walk through the decision-making process that anyone heading towards retirement should consider before deciding if they are ready. And so with that said, let's just jump straight to the video. So we're going to be using a financial planning tool called RICP to show a hypothetical 62-year-old couple with $2.1 million. So in a second here, I'm going to bring that up on the screen, and we're going to start by doing part one of any prudent retirement planning process, which I call establishing a baseline. Here on the screen, you can see this couple, Steve Zest and Amanda Zest, made up people, hypothetical couple, their financial blueprint. Now, before we jump and go through things on the screen here, the analogy I'd use is when you go meet a general practitioner or switch doctors, they're going to establish a health baseline for you, a health history chart, so to speak. So they have something that from the beginning of their work with you against which they can track your health over time and make sure that you're steering in the direction of being healthier or staying as healthy as you were when you started with them. So establishing a financial blueprint is much the same, and that's what we're looking over here. We're starting by gathering data and establishing your financial baseline. For Steve and Amanda, that looks like what you see here on the screen. They have a total net worth of around $2,700,000. This is split between their liquid net worth, which is around $2.1 million, and their house or equity in their home. What we care about when it comes to retirement really is what's their liquid net worth, because you have to have access to the money. Retirement is all about what you're going to spend and how you're going to manage that spending. Now, Steve has a couple retirement accounts, and the majority of their savings are in Steve's retirement accounts. He has a $170,000 Roth IRA, which you can see right here, and he has a $1,160,000 401k. Now, he's still employed, and both Steve and Amanda would like to explore retiring at age 62. Steve is already age 62. Amanda will be age 62 shortly. And so while the money's still in the 401k, the assumption is that both of them are no longer going to be saving to these accounts. Amanda has her own retirement accounts, around $400,000 split between a Roth IRA and a SEP IRA. And then together they have some cash, $140,000 of which is in a certificate of deposit right here, and then $240,000 of which is in a joint brokerage account. This is going to come into play later when we go through some of the models, but that joint brokerage account actually has basically a $235,000 cost, meaning there's very little long-term cap gains that's locked in there. And so it's essentially tax-free invested money in this $240,000 account. This will come into play later. And then Steve and Amanda also have a primary home that they own, which is worth around $800,000. They still do have a mortgage. You can see that mortgage down here of around $217,000 that they expect to pay off by the year 2032. In this plan, we're assuming that it is 2024, so in about 8 years. The question for Steve and Amanda, much more important than just the amount of assets they have, is really how much they want to spend in retirement. Now, Steve and Amanda have filled out an expense worksheet we provided for them, and on that expense worksheet, all their expenses separate from their housing-related expenses. So not including their mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and home maintenance, they expect that they'll spend $5,000 per month, and that's because they filled out an expense worksheet showing what they believe they're spending today while they're still, 62 and still working. And they don't want to have a dramatic cut in their lifestyle. And so that's what they're telling us they want to spend. We've got their health history, basically their financial baseline. Let's tab over to the retirement tab here, and we're going to look at what the financial planning tool tells us their Monte Carlo probability is. Monte Carlo is a score between 1 and 100 that tells them roughly how likely are they to live the rest of their life without running out of money. We won't go too deep into the mechanics of Monte Carlo in this video. There's plenty of other helpful information on YouTube if you do want to watch what Monte Carlo is exactly. Now, what you can see here is that with the information they've provided and the assets that they have a 95% chance of success in their odds of living through the end of life without running out of money. In the plan here, we have an assumption that they both live till 95. That's a conservative lifespan. Most people don't live that long, but we're going to leave it because a conservative plan is a good plan. And if they happen not to live that long, well, their odds of not running out of money simply goes down. Now, it's really important to establish two things here at this point. The first is that if there are flaws in the inputted data, we're going to get an improper Monte Carlo read. And that's exactly what happens here for Steve and Amanda. In this hypothetical scenario, they tell us they spend $5,000 per month outside of their housing costs. Well, after going through a bookkeeping exercise and actually doing the categorization of their past 3 months of expenses, we find that they are actually spending $7,000 per month in their actual expenses outside of housing costs. And again, after some dialogue with Steve and Amanda, they tell us they don't want to have a dramatic cut to their lifestyle. They want to see, can they retire at 62 and continue spending the money that they're spending now? So we need to make a change in here because $2,000 per month is a big difference. They don't want to cut lifestyle. So let's see what that actually looks like. So we're going to go down in here and put in the more accurate expense amount. And you can see that has a big dramatic change to the proposed plan's rate of success. It goes down 26 percentage points from 95 to 69. Here we'll make our second important point when it comes to retirement planning, which is that Monte Carlo, while useful, it tells us directionally where someone will travel is not all that useful when it comes to thinking about where the risk will be in this person's plan. And what I mean by that is the risk front-loaded in the first 10 years of their retirement? Is the risk back-loaded in the last 10 years of your retirement? Right? Your comfort, or Steve and Amanda's comfort with their Monte Carlo score here can change dramatically if they find out that the risk is really backloaded into the age 85 to 95. And they might both say to themselves, well, our family health history, people don't live that long in our family. We're willing to take some more risk at the back of our lifespan because we don't, people don't live that long in our family. And we just don't know that we might get there, as compared to maybe they would be much less comfortable with having the risk front loaded in the first 10 years of their retirement. And that makes them really uncomfortable. So Monte Carlo doesn't tell us that. So we have to explore a separate area, which is specifically the cash flow section. We need to go look at what is their actual spending tolerance? How does that affect the portfolio? And how comfortable are they if they were to know where the risk is based on where they're spending the most money proportionally out of their retirement portfolio? So we're going to tab through there in a second, but really briefly, a 69% probability of success is a fine probability of success in some cases. It's really person to person. In general, in our peak financial planning, if you're under 60% probability of success on Monte Carlo, we might be a little too uncomfortable with that, especially if you're within 1 year of retiring. The further you are from retirement, the more time you have to steer the ship. So a lower probability of success can be adjusted for. Now, because Steve and Amanda are right up against their desired retirement deadline, they're going to have less time to steer the ship. And so we're going to have less influence over this number. We're going to have a limited range of retirement planning action items that can be proposed. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to look at this cash flow number and see where is the risk for them. Is the risk front-loaded, back-loaded, or in between? And then based on that, show you guys, the viewers, how we would use that to generate the set of action items that they should consider to either increase their probability of success from a Monte Carlo standpoint or increase the dollar amount that they can spend in retirement, which are proxies, right? The higher your Monte Carlo, what that tells you is you have more room to spend in retirement, right? So without further ado, let's jump into that. We're going to jump to the cash flows section here, and we're going to start by just assuming that there's no changes to their plan. They have this $2.1 million of liquid assets. They spend $7,000 a month outside of housing costs. And here in this cash flow chart, we're actually going to export this and show it in a spreadsheet because it's a little bit easier. We're going to get what we call their required portfolio income number, which is the dollar amount that their retirement portfolio is responsible for each year in their retirement. That is what's called your required portfolio income. So I'm going to download the spreadsheet. We're going to tab over to the spreadsheet, and we have a bunch of different scenarios in here that we're going to go through. So if you see here right now on the screen, we have this cash flow chart that shows the year the distribution would take place, the couple's age, Steve and Amanda's age, what their portfolio balance would be, what's called their RPI, which is required portfolio income, as a dollar amount. Again, that is the dollar amount that would be withdrawn from the portfolio. And then their RPI percent, which is just a fancy way of saying their actual distribution rate, the percent that would be distributed out of the portfolio. One thing I need to mention here is that Steve and Amanda have a pension that would kick in at Steve's age 63. So they are getting $28,000 of guaranteed income that is taxable at the beginning of their distribution phase. In this scenario that we're showing on the screen here, they will not have taken Social Security income until age 67. So they get this $28,000 pension, Social Security at 67. And now with that said, what we can see here is that they have kind of what we would consider distribution bands, which kind of highlight where the risk in their retirement would be based on their age. And you can see here in the first 8 years of their retirement, from 2024 till 2031, their distribution rates range from 5.85% to almost 8% here in 2028. And we'll talk about that in just a second here. But their average distribution rate over this 8-year period is 6.32%. Now, I'm not saying whether that's good or whether that's bad. I'm just saying now they know this number and they can see that this is compared to from age 71 for Steve onward, their distribution rate goes down pretty dramatically and hovers in the 3.5% range roughly for the remaining 26 years or the next 20 years or so of their retirement. Now, that's just a point of comparison. Again, we're not establishing good or bad here, just showing. But now they know this information. Now there's two things to note here as well. The first is that in 2028, they will have used up all their cash or cash-like investments. And in 2028, their expenses see a dramatic increase. Their RPI goes from $134,000 to $173,000. And that's because now they have to start taking distributions from retirement accounts, and there's tax associated with that. And tax can be considered an expense in retirement. So they've distributed all their cash, and now all of a sudden the distribution rate goes up for a couple years, and then it drops back down. And the reason it drops back down is because by 2032, they will have paid off their mortgage, and all they'll be responsible now for is property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, right? So a big expense drops off. And you can see that results in their distribution rate or RPI percent going down dramatically from 5.78% to 3.66. Now, a third thing that happens here is in 2029, they start receiving Social Security. Like we said, they're receiving it at full retirement age. And so you can see the combination of those things running through their cash, which brings their distribution rate up or their distribution requirement up, but then also getting Social Security and having their home paid off results in that distribution rate going down. So that's their baseline. They have a higher front end distribution rate, a lower middle year distribution rate, and then a very high end of life distribution rate. And that's fine. The end of life distribution rate is always high because you're going to have your highest amount of expected healthcare costs in a small series of years. Their average distribution rate over their entire lifespan or their entire retirement lifespan is 5.5%. And that can be very misleading because 5.5% is a fine number to look at, but that again doesn't tell you where the risk is, right? It makes it hard to compare, which is why it's so helpful to break it down into these three kind of bands. Now, we want to use this information because the conversation with Steve and Amanda might look something like, well, what makes you the most nervous? Are you the most nervous about your retirement being risky at the front end or at the back end? Generally at Peak Financial Planning, our advice is to be the most cautious about the risk at the front end of your retirement because you have the longest retirement lifespan still ahead of you at the front of your retirement. At the front of your retirement, you're also the youngest and healthiest and going to be able or would probably want to take advantage of your youth and your health and to do things. And so having spending risk at the front end of your retirement is the least tasteful in our opinion. And so we want to explore what types of retirement action items this couple can consider that would help reduce the risk at the front of their retirement and maybe distribute it more evenly across their retirement. And so there's really 4 scenarios that they could consider. They could consider taking Social Security early at 62. The effect that's going to have, and we'll show it on the screen here in just a second, taking Social Security at 62 will give them an extra source of guaranteed income earlier. The effect it will have is effectively lowering their distribution rate in the early years, but it will result in a higher distribution rate later in retirement. The other thing claiming Social Security early will do for them is it will make their cash go further, right? Instead of running out of cash or running through their cash and cash-like investments by 2027 or 2028, they will run through their cash by, let's say, 2029. So maybe a year and a half later. And let's show that on the screen here. So now you can see I've pulled up another RPI chart that's right here. And you can see that if they claim Social Security at 62, their distribution rate is still hovering in the 5% range, but they don't have this really high peak at 8%. Rather, their highest distribution requirement in this 8-year period will be 6.5%. And then it drops back down at 2032 when their home is paid off. And in this scenario, they claim Social Security at 62, so they get that reduced benefit. The average distribution rate in the early years of their retirement drops from 6.32% when they claim at 67 to 5.44%. Maybe that makes them feel comfortable. That's a 90 basis point lower distribution requirement in those first 8 years. Maybe they're concerned about sequence of returns risk, or maybe they're concerned about just overtaxing the portfolio in the early years of their retirement and having, flattish market returns on their portfolio. And this scenario, claiming Social Security actually smooths or eases that out. However, what it does do is it increases their distribution rate in their middle retirement years from 3.5% to 4.2%. So they get a 90 basis point reduction in the first 8 years, but they get a 70 basis point distribution rate increase in their later years or in their middle retirement years. What happens if they claim Social Security at 70? We'll pull this up on the screen now as well. So now you can see on the screen here, we have what if they claim Social Security at 70? Well, this doesn't solve their upfront distribution rate issue. In fact, their distribution rate has a peak in their first 8 years of 8.61%, and they have several years actually where they're carrying this 8% distribution requirement as opposed to just 1 year in the first scenario we looked at. That might make them more nervous, that might not make them more nervous. Again, it's just data. But what you can see here is their average distribution rate at the front end for those first 8 years is 7.14% as compared to 6.32%. So it's gone up rather than down. However, their distribution rate during their middle years now goes down to 3.22% from a rate of 3.5%, right? So they have this longer period with a lower distribution requirement, and that's the trade for claiming Social Security later at age 70. One thing I haven't shown is this little bucket here where it shows average distribution rate. For each of these scenarios, there's an average distribution rate. You can see they don't actually have big material changes. Claiming Social Security at 67, they have a distribution rate of 5.5% roughly. Claiming Social Security at 62, they have an average distribution rate of 5.94, so roughly 40 basis point higher. Claiming Social Security at 70, they have an average distribution rate of 5.47. So they're not getting a huge difference through these different options on the average level. What it really matters most is on that front end, right? That's where we're seeing the biggest change in terms of their distribution rate. The risk for this couple, as you can see now, having explored 3 scenarios, is in those first 8 years of retirement, right? That's where their distribution rate matters most, in my opinion, because they have an above average, an above prudent, let's say, distribution requirement, because they'd have to be living off of assets before getting those guaranteed sources of income. We can consider 2 more common scenarios, and I won't go into too much detail here, but because Roth conversions are such a common internet topic, retirement planning topic, I thought I'd just show 2 Roth conversion scenarios for this couple. What a Roth conversion effectively will do is front load more expenses. You pay a tax in the current year or in the early years of retirement to not pay taxes later in retirement. I'll make a whole nother video or a second part to this video showing Roth conversions as a consideration for this couple, Steve and Amanda. But really briefly, just to show Roth converting, if they were to go with their baseline scenario, which is claim Social Security at 67, retire at 62, and they Roth convert in the 10% bracket, their distribution rate in the first 8 years goes to 6.37% from 6.32%. So not a huge increase in distribution rate for this couple, but that's because they actually don't have a lot of benefit from doing Roth conversions. The financial planning tool only recommends something like $20,000 total of Roth conversions, because effectively what the planning tool will recommend for this couple is spending down all their cash and cash-like investments, spending down all their tax-deferred investments, and basically passing away having never touched their Roth investments, which ends up leaving them at age 95 with 100% Roth money in this hypothetical plan. I ran the same scenario for what if they did Roth conversions if they were to take Social Security at 70. That one, again, doesn't have much of an impact. Again, the tool would only recommend a very, very modest amount of Roth conversions for them, so it doesn't have a significant change to their distribution rate overall, because they would be spending down their money first and not doing significant Roth conversions. And effectively what this all means, if we back out of the spreadsheet and just come back to the plan and ignore what's on the screen for a second, effectively what this all means is this couple with $2.1 million wanting to retire at 62, they can do it. A 70% probability of success in Monte Carlo, if they're willing to use, let's say, a spending guardrails or a floor and ceiling distribution rate approach that isn't inflation adjusted, but is more about changing their spending behaviors year by year based on market returns and how their portfolio is performing, they can certainly navigate this 30-year retirement or 33-year retirement that they want to consider. The main thing here is that the risk is all front-loaded in the first 8 years of their retirement, so they're going to be very susceptible to poor sequence of returns. They're going to have to make, or will be willing to make, dramatic lifestyle changes, meaning spending adjustments, in the first 8 years of their retirement if their portfolios have poor sequence of returns. And they've said they don't really want to do that, but with further conversation, maybe they would understand this better and consider that. The other alternative really is going to be working a few years longer, which effectively reduces the length of their retirement and would also give them a source of income during the years in which they're most susceptible to sequence of returns risk. We can show these other considerations in a second part to this video, as I said, which I can put out in a week or two. But the summary here is that For Steve and Amanda, retiring at 62 is possible, but they're going to have to understand the trade-offs here in terms of what they'd have to be willing to give up in terms of lifestyle. And really, the ultimate thing I hope you take away from watching this is that you don't really want to wait till age 62 to plan for a retirement at 62, because Steve and Amanda might have started at 61 or 59 and known some of this information and made some changes either to their spending behavior or their saving behavior that would have resulted in a higher probability of success if they were uncomfortable with a 69-ish% probability of success. And so ultimately the idea here is start your retirement planning as soon as possible. It doesn't matter if you want to retire early or retire later, just the earlier you start, the more runway you have to make prudent changes and get comfortable with living and understanding what your probability of success might be, and then what your cash flow or distribution rates might be in the different bands of your retirement. Anyhow, thank you for your time and attention. I hope you found the video helpful. If you'd like to get some more information about how we help our clients navigate the retirement risk zone and retire with confidence and ease, you can visit our website, www.thepeakfp.com, for more information. Thanks, and see you in the next video.